Hello, Megan. How are you?
I'm pretty well, and yourself?
I can't complain. We're enjoying, I guess, I don't know if you can call it Indian. It is Indian summer because it's technically fall right now, but it's quite lovely up here. Yourself?
I am pretty well. I'm sitting in my office, and it is also 95 degrees here, so which I like. Many people don't fancy that level of heat in DC, but I really enjoy it, so it's good for me.
Huh. I was not aware you enjoyed it that hot.
Oh, yeah. And I'm married to an Eskimo, so there's this constant war between us over the thermostat, which I guess is pretty common among married couples.
Yes. No, without giving too much information, I do remember when Erica was pregnant was the one time when she was like a blast furnace, so it was the one time our temperatures actually synced up a little bit.
Well, we're currently, because we're homeless, we're staying with my mother. And
well, that won't be stressful at all. That's good.
Well, luckily my mother, I actually believe this, although of course you never know, right, when it's your own mother. Mm-hmm. Luckily my mother is pretty chill.
Okay.
You know, if she were a different sort of mother-in-law, my mother's the kind of mother-in-law who like has food in the house and occasionally does laundry. But other than that, she's not like, you know, come here so that I can lecture you on your vitamin intake. But of course my mother and I both like it warmer, and my husband sneaks down and turns up the thermostat. She comes down in the morning and he's still asleep, and we're both like sitting there shivering, and we turn it off. It's really probably more than blogging heads ever needed to know about my life. Anyways.
Yes.
So
Well, you've been ruined for future administration positions, a topic we'll get to a little bit later, but go ahead.
Yes, when the committee starts grilling me about my thermostat preferences, it's all over. So we were going to start off today by talking about college tuition.
Yes.
And since you were I've been blogging about it, and since you're a professor, perhaps you can explain where all our damn money is going, Dan.
Well, I don't know. I'm really working hard right now, and my salary increased. No, it depends. First of all, I mean, it depends what we're talking about in terms of tuition increases, because I think one of the minor beefs I have with this about tuition increases going up, I don't deny they're going up by a dramatic amount, but I always wonder if there's an excessive focus on what, for lack of a way of putting it, the list price is. The one thing universities have gotten much, much better at is sort of discriminatory pricing in terms of tuition and fees, where, you know, for lack of a better way of putting it, they will charge full price to those people who can afford to pay full price, but people who can't pay full price, they're perfectly willing to discount and or arrange for other ways that they can get the money.
I think that that's kind of true, but I would add some caveats to that.
Okay.
I mean, the first is that that's much less true on the state university side, which is where, you know, you and I both went to fairly elite schools, and there's a tendency to sort of like think of what you experienced as being
Typical.
Very similar to what most of the country goes
Which,
to.
in fact,
But
it's not.
Most people do not go to expensive private schools.
That's correct.
And so, by the way, I'm just going to let the audience know here that we have a motion sensor in our office, and due to the placement of my chair, my light will go off periodically if I do not like randomly start waving at the motion sensor, which is why I'm doing that, not because I'm like taunting Dan when he can't see me.
You know what? Just in sympathy with you, every once in a while, randomly, I'll just wave as well. You know.
So I think the first thing is the tuition's gone up at state universities too,
Yeah.
and it's not because they've gotten so much better at this exquisite price discrimination.
Yeah.
The other thing is that, like, while that was true prior to the financial crisis, in a lot of places it's now not true, and people are having to leave school because they're not making up these grants.
Right.
But the option that they did not explore was cutting the cost of going to the college, right?
Yeah.
So I think that, you know, there's definitely an element of price discrimination, but even 20 years ago, which is terrifying to think that it was 20 years ago when my parents showed up at the University of Pennsylvania to drop me off, but even 20 years ago, something like 70% of the kids at Penn were on some form of financial aid.
Right. No, I think that was probably true of Williams as well.
The tuition has gone up at Penn a lot. So they were price discriminating even then. So I'm not sure that explains to me what's happening with the tuitions now. And, you know, like my explanation, which, you know, is maybe a little bit less charitable, is that with student loans, with the increasing prevalence of student loans, that it's allowed students to monetize more of the future benefits of getting this college degree now.
Oh, yeah.
And when they're doing that, the colleges get to take the rake off. So the colleges are taking a bigger percentage of your future earnings than they used to be able to, because they used to be constrained by whatever money you happen to have in your pocket at the moment.
Well, no, I mean, I don't disagree. This is a classic sort of expansion, expansion of credit availability. Therefore, it allows. I think it is also, I think it might be partially also due to increases in inequality, which means you can then make the higher price extremely high, knowing that you're not. Again, most people are not going to pay that, but you really can soak the rich, soak the uber rich that way. But go ahead. I mean, I think both elements of the story are at work.
Yeah, I think the question that people had asked me that I've been thinking about is, so why has this gotten worse? Because student loans started becoming available in the late 60s,
right.
and certainly people I knew had them. And I think that part of it is just the social evolution of these things, right? Is that when I was in college, your parents would try really, really hard to enable you to get by without debt.
Right.
But as it became more common, you get two things happening. First of all, it becomes fewer and fewer people can afford to do it without debt.
Yeah.
And so the flip side of that is it becomes more acceptable to take on the debt. And so my suspicion is that what's happening here now is that we're really hitting the inflection point of the curve, where at the point where most people assume that they're going to graduate with college with significant debt, that you really start to be able to monetize this financial advantage that people get from their college degrees. Mm-hmm. And so I actually expect tuition inflation, because as far as I know, it hasn't abated during the recession, which is kind of shocking. So I expect this to go for some time. What I don't have a good handle on is what the money is being spent on, because you talk to administrators and they blame the professors, and of course you talk to professors and they complain about the sports programs and the proliferation of useless administrators, and then everyone complains about the fact that students apparently expect to live in something akin to a 4-star hotel for their entire 4 years there.
I'm going to blame the students, but in a second. But go ahead.
Well, I'm interested to hear your perspective.
Well, all right. First, let me give the following two caveats. The first is you're obviously talking about my bread and butter here, so I might be somewhat biased in terms of my attitude about this. But the second thing is that part of the reason I became an academic in the first place was because of my sheer and total allergy to administration and accounting, which means I probably am not genetically predisposed to even understand this. That said, my hunch would be that part of what's going on is, in fact, that the money is largely being dolloped to that aspect of student life which might not necessarily be considered academic. And by that, we're talking about, the gym, the various other facilities available on campus, improvements in housing, and so forth. Not to mention for lack of a better way of putting it, I would assume the amount of money being devoted for younger kids would be called special needs, but basically accommodations for kids who otherwise, let's say a generation ago, would not have gone to college because they were either so socially dysfunctional or had so many, gaps in their knowledge that they wouldn't be able to cut it. Now you have to take care of these students as well.
Is that true at Tufts? I mean, do you get kids who have real problems in those areas who need remedial help?
I don't know if I would say remedial. What I'm thinking about more are, let's say, kids who have been diagnosed with, ADD or ADHD or Asperger's or some other, issue where an accommodation has to be made or some sort of counseling has to be done to deal with those students. And might I add that, on the whole, objectively is probably a good thing because it means, I think Tyler Cowen made a great point about this about a year ago, that's actually one of the things the America's higher education system excels at, which is it actually finds useful things for people with these kinds of issues to do. But you do have to create this whole support apparatus. And let me be clear, I'm not saying that that's the only thing that's causing prices to go up. But I'm very dubious that it's actually professors because, at the same time, as you're talking about, as tuition prices are going up, the other thing that's happened within the professoriate is that the kind of professors like me, which is to say tenured or tenure track, as a percentage of total faculty has dramatically declined. Well,
I think the argument, though, is that the people like you don't teach as much as they used to. That 30 years ago, everyone would have been teaching, a 3-4 or a 4-4 load. And now it's more like a 2-2.
It is, yeah.
If that.
Yeah.
And that, so yes, on the one hand, there are not so many of you as a percentage of the total teachers. On the other hand, that's because they've had to hire all these extra teachers to take over the teaching that you guys aren't doing anymore.
I mean, this is where I have to say, at least 20 years ago, the teaching loads were still 2-2. So I don't think that's it, at least at the top places.
Yeah, I remember actually when my international economics professor was really young, or looked really young. And so I naturally assumed he was the TA, and it wasn't until the midterm that I realized he was the actual professor. Because it was not uncommon at Penn to go through an entire course without ever really running into the professor.
Yeah, no, this was...
very often, anyway.
This was the major advantage of going to a liberal arts school. If I had gone to a university at that age, I would have gotten completely slammed by... I would have been completely naive and not realized that you probably want to take courses with professors as opposed to graduate students. That's a whole separate issue. But anyway, so I don't think... I mean, it's entirely possible that some professors might be soaking up greater resources, but I don't think that explains everything, and it certainly wouldn't explain what's going on at state schools, because in some ways salaries at state schools haven't kept pace with the private, with private colleges. So I don't know if that works for that. It might be. The fundamental reason might be that the prices are going up because they can, because the perception is still that a college degree from a good either private or state institution is the ticket to middle-class prosperity. And so long as that is the belief, then obviously tuition can go up and no one's really going to complain that much.
Well, I think the question then is, Brian Kaplan, among others, has been having this long argument, is how much of college is signaling, which is to say that, the degree isn't what you do in school has nothing to do with why employers want to hire you.
Yeah.
It's more to do with the fact that you can prove that you're the kind of person with the social, intellectual endowments that will allow you to spend 4 years in college and graduate.
Right.
And how much of it has to do with the actual skills that you impart. I tend to lean on the signaling explanation, which doesn't make the professors I know happy. But
Megan, you ignorant slut. Let me go on. No, go ahead.
Well, I mean, I think the thing that I really notice is that faculty are in no way, basically, they're not really selected for their ability to teach, right? I mean, it's important, and everyone talks about caring about teacher evaluations and so forth.
Yeah.
But that really isn't what gets you tenure.
No, it's not.
And it really isn't what gets you hired.
No.
And they don't actually invest at all in improving. You can say that they do supervisory things, but in general, the amount of effort expended on improving people's teaching ability is pretty minimal. At least from everything that I know from the people I've talked to who are academics, that if the actual education were such an important component of this, why doesn't anyone at the university invest any effort? I'm not saying that teachers don't invest effort in teaching. Yeah. I'm just saying, at monitoring, improving, etc., the effectiveness of the teachers. We've all had some really just horrifying teachers who were very good researchers, but really terrible teachers who didn't manage to get anything across their classes at all. And given that that's really common, but I've never had a really good teacher who just sucked at research. I've got to adjuncts or whatever, but in general, I've never had a tenured professor who was not a good researcher, but just so fabulous at teaching kids that it didn't matter.
Right.
I don't understand how education could, in fact, be the priority of these institutions, or why they're set up that way if it is more skill imparting and less signaling.
Well, okay, this is where, again, to be fair, I think we talked before about the bias you have going to an elite school as opposed to a state school. I actually think that bias kicks in here, because there are universities and colleges where, in fact, teaching is the primary, criteria through which people will get tenure.
But then I think the question is, why are the best jobs going to the people who go to the schools that do the least to try to teach?
Because
why is the signal most valuable? Why is a diploma from Harvard, where they don't invest any effort at all in making sure that the people can teach well? Why is that so much more valuable than a diploma from Arizona State, where they actually spend a lot of time making sure that the people they have know how to teach.
Okay, I'll give you two answers. The first answer, and this is the official answer I'm required to give you as a professor, is, hold on, let me get into character. Megan, you don't understand. Teaching and research are complementary tools. If you are doing cutting-edge research, it means that you are right at the outer frontier of knowledge that's being created. And only by being out on the knowledge, frontier can you communicate the most cutting-edge knowledge to your students. And therefore, the people who take, classes from people who are doing, really sophisticated and rigorous research will be imparted with much greater and more sophisticated knowledge than those who are just being taught by assembly line PhDs. That's the official answer. The unofficial answer might be as follows, which is, how to put this? It's possible that if you do have professors who are not necessarily the most communicative, the clearest of professors, but they're probably pretty good at putting together a syllabus, then in some ways, for you to do well in that class, you actually have to be able to have the skills to learn on your own. As opposed to, let's say, going to a normal state school where you would just have a teacher feed it to you like pablum. And therefore, the students who manage to excel at the places like Harvard and Stanford or what have you are clearly not just smart, but they're actually self-learning. And therefore, in some ways, higher skilled than the ones coming from a, cookie-cutter state university.
But that sort of implies that grade inflation at Harvard and similar schools is such that, first of all, if half the class is an A- average, how do you know who excelled? I guess you can pick out the people who really just didn't do anything and barely showed up for class and didn't read the syllabus. But aside from that, you don't actually know who's managed to teach themselves in one of these courses where the professor, really can't be bothered to do more than pull himself out of bed every third morning.
It's really hard to do, Megan.
No, I'm sounding really terrible. Most of I've had amazing professors. Mm-hmm. I'm sure that you are one of them. It's not that I think that professors don't work hard.
Yeah.
I did get the sense at Penn that they weren't really particularly interested in us. That they had just sort of thought of us as these obstacles to doing what they were really interested in doing, which was not talking to a bunch of undergraduates about how we felt about Uncle Tom's Cabin or calculus or whatever.
I've never had that feeling, Megan. I don't know what you're talking about.
But take math, right? We had a large number of TAs who didn't speak English. Mm-hmm. My TA in first semester calculus was so incomprehensible. I flunked the course for a number of reasons. I subsequently learned.
Now it comes out. Now the bitterness comes out.
I was a horrifying student.
Okay.
Really, I was terrible. My freshman, I was one of the classic almost flunks out early in her college career and then comes back and has a 4.0 after she figures out that no, really, you do have to do the work and show up for class. Mm-hmm. So I can't blame that on him, but a lot of my classmates really did. There was no possibility of getting any help. They didn't understand anything. So in some sense, yes, you had to be either a miraculous self-study in calculus, because you certainly couldn't get any assistance at all from the TA because he was, I think, Hungarian. And it wasn't possible to understand anything he said. Mm-hmm. The word derivative turned into darewada. And I think he was especially bad, and he may have had some sort of additional speech impediment. Mm-hmm. But it's not uncommon that you have in the sciences and in math these TAs who literally just don't speak enough English to communicate anything to a student who's struggling at a top-level university. And that strikes me as sort of arguing again that they're not that invested in communicating anything in particular to the undergraduates. And yes, if you're a self-starter, you can get through. But even very smart kids who are quite motivated do have trouble with things from time to time. And I think, the tests don't, if a professor is bad, often the tests don't measure anything, right? Because again, they're not invested in building, and I'm not in any way attempting to build a blanket indictment. I'm not saying this is more common than not. Mm-hmm. I'm just saying that the existence of these people, that the universities clearly just aren't interested in sort of investigating or stopping or improving, indicates to me that the university itself does not perceive this to be a problem to its core mission.
Well,
so
okay.
I want to be very careful and not sound like one of those tenure-bashing lunatics. I mean, I'm against tenure for a whole host of really complicated reasons that have nothing to do with the belief that professors will suddenly turn lazy.
Yeah.
It's just like when I see the observed behavior of the administration and indeed the departments, they're getting rid of this is not their priority. And so I'm not saying it's a majority. It's just I'm saying that the actual education of undergraduates does not seem to be the thing that they're most focused on.
Well, I mean, let me just...
Individual professors may be very focused on it, but the mission of the university as a whole seems curiously uninterested in quality control of what they have declared to be their core mission.
I actually think things have changed a little bit on this one. I mean, I'm not necessarily disagreeing with you, but I think the trend has actually been towards a greater emphasis on undergraduate education. And here I'm somewhat handicapped.
That may be true.
Because I'm handicapped because I actually teach at a graduate school. I haven't taught undergraduates now for 5 years. But that said, being at both, at all the universities I've been at, with each passing year, you see more and more either programs or, assessment of evaluations where, in fact, the teaching performance counts. It doesn't count in a way, you're right, it doesn't count in the big sense of, would bad teaching evaluations prevent you from getting tenure at a research university? No, it's not going to do that. On the other hand, there are littler ways in which they can make, bad teaching evaluations will make your life difficult as a professor. It affects things like, year-to-year salary increases in some cases. It affects your ability to choose what you're going to teach. And, it's also just the simple fact that, if you're actually teaching and you're bad at it, it basically means you're guaranteeing that half of the thing you do, you're not going to enjoy. And so this is not to deny that there are bad teachers out there. Of course there are bad teachers. But there are also a lot of eccentric teachers that might be quite good. It's just they only cater to a certain kind of audience. I mean, but...
Oh, like my favorite professor in college, about half his students hated him.
Yeah.
I'm not talking about the people who are just hated. I'm talking about the people who are incredibly boring and just don't do anything. Basically, their undergraduates may or may not force themselves to learn to regurgitate a certain amount of material in order to pass the test, but who just aren't good at communicating sort of the core concepts and excitement of their topic to anyone.
That's just sad.
Those people from whom no one emerges thinking, I really enjoyed that class, I really got a lot out of it. And there are teachers around like that. I'm not the majority. I don't think anyone, it didn't seem, at least when I was in schools, that the administration cared one way or the other. Whether those teachers were out there.
There might be one other reason for this, which is that, the mantra that is made about universities all over the place is that they are, they're run by the professors. It's supposed to be a professor-run organization. And yet the dirty secret, or one of the dirty secrets about the academy, is that as professors, we very rarely go to other professors' classes. I don't know how my colleagues teach, unless I'm evaluating them for, actual teaching, as you said, and I have yet to be on a committee that does that. I have very rarely seen how my colleagues teach. Some of them I know are quite good. Some of them are perhaps not as good. But in some ways, I lack the data that you're asking for me to answer this question.
Well, I guess what I think is that if this stuff were actually an important component of people graduating, someone would be looking at it, right? Someone would be attempting to determine how much value they were adding. There would be competition between universities to add more value to students. I don't see any of that. And so what it seems to me is more likely is that
the problem is
the prime component is that you have managed that kids who come out of Williams or Harvard or what have you are bright, motivated kids from usually the upper middle class or above. Or if they're from the middle class or below, they're kids who are extremely bright and motivated.
Yeah.
They have an enormous amount of social capital, and they know how to navigate sort of the adult world better than a lot of kids, or this particular adult world better than a lot of kids who are going to graduate from a state university and don't have that kind of family background. And so, yes, you've selected all of those kids, you put them in one place, and then you have that signal. They managed to stay there for 4 years. They probably don't have terrible drug habit or impulse control problem. It strikes me that that's likely to be the larger component of what universities are offering to employers and what those degrees offer to employers, simply because if it weren't such a large component, if the actual education were a larger component, then someone would be attempting to assess that. And it's really hard to assess.
Well, part of the problem is the assessment aspect, which is, when you talk about assessing research output, that's actually relatively easy to do in a lot of places. You're assessing journal articles. You can even do things like hit factors and citation counts and so forth. That's relatively objective, for lack of a better way of putting it, and pretty straightforward. The only way that people have to measure teaching is from student evaluations, and you know as well as I do that there is a real problem with relying too much on student evaluations.
Because they go to the easiest and the best-looking teachers.
Yes. You want that chili pepper.
I assume that your evaluations are extremely high.
Yes, as far as I know, but, it's been that's... No, not because of that. I think my evaluations are high because I weed out crybabies within the first 2 weeks most of the time. But the fact is that, if you are a professor and you know that student evaluations will factor a lot into pay increases or promotion or what have you, and there are places where that matters, well, then you know what the obvious incentives you have are, which is you give easier grades, easier coursework, and so forth.
Right.
And until you come up with a way around that, and I'm not sure there is a good way around that. The only way I can think of is incredibly labor-intensive, which is to literally have an outside observer take the course. And even there, I'm not sure that's great for a variety of reasons. Then it might be...
The outsider would presumably also get pissed off when you gave him a C.
Exactly, yes, or the outsider would be pissed off he's got to be in the class or something like that. The point is that this might be an instance where it's not so much pernicious, but it might be measurable outputs. Because you can measurably, measure the research output better than you can the teaching, universities feel safer relying on sort of knowns rather than unknowns. But you're right. Go ahead.
I think that's totally fair, and I don't want to push this argument too far. I guess what I'm trying to say is this: if a college like Williams felt like it could actually increase its status, it's the career prospects of its graduates, its own status, the amount of tuition it could charge, if you want to be mercenary about it, by actually producing, increasing the quality of its graduates. If it felt it had that power, I feel like it would be trying a lot harder than any school I've ever observed is actually trying to increase the quality of the product it puts out. Mm-hmm. I feel like there's a lot of effort going into increasing the quality of the product you take in by becoming more selective. But I don't feel like I see this all-out push to really, really try to produce a better undergraduate, a better graduate.
Well, in some ways,
that's because they don't think that they can.
What I'm about to say makes a professor somewhat superfluous, but in some ways the two are related, because you can argue that the best source of education you'll often get, the best source of learning you'll get as a student, is not necessarily from the professor, but it's from your fellow students. So if you do a good job of selecting a high-caliber group of smart people, just simply being surrounded by them automatically, almost by osmosis, it makes you a better, student.
The people at the career people, I think it was at Chicago, told me, basically we could put you guys on a cruise ship for the next 2 years, and we get about the same outcomes.
All right. Well, speaking of, we should.
I don't know why they didn't. It would have been cheaper.
Yeah, and also a lot warmer, obviously, for you. Exactly. Now that I think about it, given your predilection for 95-degree weather, the fact that you went to Chicago is quite startling.
It was, believe me, part of my predilection for warm weather was founded while walking my bull mastiff through the 15 below across the windswept expanse of that park on 54th and Kenwood.
Ah, yes.
I used to think I would actually die and pass out in a snowdrift, and they would find me come spring. But on to the next. We should probably leave the topic of college tuition and move on to some other burning issue of the day.
Well, speaking of half-assed efforts, let's talk about the Republican pledge to America. Is it Pledge to America?
Yes.
Yes.
Pledge to America,
which was released, I think, yesterday or the day before. I haven't seen too much of it, but I will say I did look at the foreign policy section, and I had two thoughts. The first is there's actually not a lot there. The only issues they tackle are Iran, Guantanamo, and immigration. And the second is I'm actually in a really good mood because those are the only issues they tackle. And therefore it suggests that, in fact, foreign policy is not going to be hostage during the midterm elections, and therefore even if the Republicans take over the House, it actually won't have that much effect on U.S. foreign policy.
I but briefly perused the economic part because I'm on deadline for something else, and I just didn't have time to devote the attention I felt it really deserved before I wrote about it. So I haven't written about it yet. My first take is just that, it's nice that they put everything down on paper. I think that I don't understand why we're talking about extending the Bush tax cuts. I do understand politically why we are.
Yeah.
But it just continues to bewilder me that both parties are bashing each other over the head about the deficit, and they're both so determined to expand somewhere between $2 trillion and $2.7 trillion worth of tax cuts that we could be using to close the deficit that everyone keeps saying they really care about closing.
Yes. Well, I have to say, I'm about to say something that's very rare, which is I actually agree with Paul Krugman on this. He had not, his column today. We pointed out that, if you took a look at took the pledge seriously, they basically say we want to seriously cut the deficit. We don't want to touch entitlements, and we're not going to touch defense spending, and we're not going to raise taxes. Go.
Well, we're going to have the federal government shopping on double coupon day from now on, I think that all of these things are ridiculous.
Yes.
And it gets more ridiculous. I think in the past 2 years, it has gotten ever more ridiculous because the Democrats and the Republicans both want to claim the mantle of deficit busting, and both parties now have the most hog wild. In each party, their most recent president has set new records for post-war hog wild spending. Actually, that's not true in the case of Bush. I shouldn't say that. Reagan was worse.
Yeah.
But since Reagan's their hero, then that's not really very helpful. I mean, it's just, if you don't want to balance the budget, just say so. Okay, I don't agree with you, but just admit it. The Democrats are, on the one hand, claiming that they want to balance the budget, and then they're just declaring, they pass pay-go rules, and they just declare everything they want to do emergency spending.
Right.
And the Republicans say they want to balance the budget deficit, and their sole answer to the Democrats' newest budget-busting scheme, which is the extension of the middle-class tax cuts from the Bush tax cuts, is to add to it by extending them for people who make over $250,000 a year. Just the entire thing is, to me, totally ludicrous. And I've said this for years. I said that no one cared about the deficit. I said that Democrats, loved bashing Bush about it, and as soon as they got in, they would change their tune, and I turned out to have been completely right. And Republicans suddenly went back to caring about the deficit,
right.
And as soon as they get in, they're changing their tune.
Yeah.
I was also completely right about that. I just wish we would stop talking about it. We might as well just prepare for default and do it.
Well, isn't part of this, what I found interesting about the pledge business was the way in which actually conservative activists and bloggers were really disappointed with what came out of it. And I assume that part of this is that in some ways the Republicans are in an impossible situation, which is they want to somehow tap the enthusiasm of the Tea Party activists without actually doing what the Tea Party wants them to do. Which is, as I understand it, the roots of the Tea Party activism are truly in, they actually want to see, serious deficit reduction. But the only way you can actually do serious deficit reduction is, as we know, by raising taxes and cutting entitlement spending and cutting defense spending in addition to everything else. And those things, last I checked, are really unpopular with a large swath of voters.
But that's sort of like saying, I want to be a size 6 and run marathons. I just don't want to do the part where I stop eating and go running. Yeah. I mean...
Well, let me put it this way.
They do, but they don't want to touch anything.
Yes. Let me put it this way. I think in fairness, there probably are some Tea Party activists. I mean, Rand Paul, for example, is someone who I actually think genuinely does, is willing to talk about cutting these things despite the political, toxicity, I guess, of doing that. But you're right. Most people... this has been the problem with American public opinion actually for the last 25 years, which is, do you want your taxes raised? No. Do you want government spending cut? No. Okay, well, good luck with that.
Right, and what's interesting to me is I notice is liberal bloggers have been publicizing this thing of if you actually look at the spending people want cut, no one wants to cut the big programs, which is absolutely true, but it's also absolutely true that if you say, do you want your taxes raised, they say no.
Yes.
So this does not tell us we shouldn't cut spending because people really don't want spending cut. They don't. They live in a fantasy world.
Right.
And the terrible thing is that our policy wonks have started joining them in their fantasy world, which had happened under Reagan with the supply-siders a little bit. But even then, by 1984, certainly the supply-siders had kind of realized that this hadn't worked.
Yeah.
And then you got the tax simplification of 86.
Right.
And then we all kept pretending that, and Republican politicians still say nonsense you cut tax rates and you raise the amount of taxes
Right.
that are collected. But the wonks don't believe that, and you never hear that said by anyone who's sort of serious at a conservative think tank or what have you. But, during healthcare, everyone had developed this fantasy that there was some magic pot of money that you could use to pay for it. And at the beginning of it, a bunch of us pointed out that all of these magic pots of money were attached to actual people who were going to be really upset if you tried to take it away. And that it was therefore going to be really hard. And in the end, what they did was they punted, right? They did things like the excise tax. We're putting that on high-cost healthcare plans. But because that magic pot of money turned out to be attached to a lot of angry labor unions, they put that off till 2018. And it goes down the line. Any actual sort of cutting was put off till fairly late in the bill. And they tried to insulate it from the political process.
That's like the Bush tax cuts,
works.
which the only way they could be scored at the time and be considered to be revenue neutral was that they had to expire right about now.
Well, actually, it's not quite that. This is a common misconception. What happened was it was done through reconciliation.
Right.
And reconciliation only allows you to pass things for 10 years. You can't pass a bill that has any budget effects outside of the 10-year forecast window. And so they had to expire this year, not because of they were never revenue neutral. They were always budget busting.
Right.
But simply because they could not have passed it through the reconciliation process, which they had to because
they weren't going to get
actually control the Senate.
Yeah. Okay. All right. No, that
Dick
makes more
Cheney
sense.
to break the tie. Or at least so I recall. Anyway, so now everyone has just started making up these fantasy magic pots of money. And they've actually stopped even identifying what they are, right? And this is the great thing in the Democratic health plan of the IPAB, which is the board that's going to tell us what treatments aren't effective, and so forth. We're not even naming them. They're the great magic asterisks of Reagan's early budgets was, unidentified cuts to come to be identified later.
Yes.
That's basically the bulk, that and sort of across the board, very late implemented service provider payment cuts. That's how they've done it. And the Republicans aren't even identifying it all, right? It's just like, we're going to end the job-killing tax cuts.
Yeah.
And then we're going to go, find some money, because there's definitely a magic pot of money in there somewhere. And we're going to take that whole pot of money and we're going to give it back to you as tax cuts and also balance the budget deficit. I don't know why they didn't promise to refurbish everyone's living room while they were there. I mean, it's just...
And a pony.
And a pony. I want a pony.
Exactly.
We don't have
no,
it's
it is definitely a depressing time to be a wonk. I won't dispute that. Although I did want to ask you something about Christine O'Donnell. This is the Delaware Republican nominee. And I think one of the things that's been amusing about this is that, she, during the 90s, was, in her either late teens, early 20s, and was on a lot of television shows, MTV, and I think Politically Correct with Bill Maher, where she said a lot of very, very silly things that are now coming back to bite her in the butt. And I found it interesting because John Podhoretz, I think, wrote an interesting column on this in commentary where he said this is the problem with, young pundits. And he reminded me of the days back like when MSNBC was just starting out where they only wanted to have 20-somethings on, dressed very casually, and that was the way they were going to get the hip young crowd. But as a result, you have this whole category...
Who love to watch cable news.
What? Yes.
Who love to watch daytime cable news.
But as a result, you now have this whole cluster of people that might eventually go into politics, but were foolish enough to, do anything to get on television, and as a result said a lot of stupid things and will come back to bite them. And of course, the thing I keep wondering about this is that happened in the 90s. And, this decade, it's going to be, A, people stupid enough to talk on blogging heads, but B, people who have their own blogs and so on and so forth. I mean, do you think, as sad as the state of American politics is now, do you think, this kind of thing is going to actually act as a further constraint?
All I can say is that when I look back upon my late teens and early 20s, I humbly thank God every day that there was no Facebook around to record my total idiocy. When I started blogging, I said things I shouldn't because I treated the medium like sitting around in your dorm room with your friends and chit-chatting rather than something that 10 years later people were going to be able to find some stupid thing I'd said, throw it back at me. And I think it's much worse for people. And I think the thing about O'Donnell is it's no editor, right? That's her real problem is not that she was in the media. but that she was in the media and no one was like, hey, you know what's not a good idea to say? This. She was on outlets that just allowed her to shoot off her mouth.
Although you could argue that the only reason, but to be fair, you could argue the only reason she was on those outlets was precisely because she was willing to say the dumbass things.
No, absolutely. Yeah. But the existence of outlets like that, those outlets hadn't existed 10 years before.
Okay.
But on the other hand, you look at the stuff that P.J. O'Rourke wrote when he was
writing for Rolling Stone.
Before that, I mean, he actually has a great book called Age and Guile Beat Youth, Innocence, and a Bad Haircut.
Yes, I've got that.
And you look at some of the stuff he wrote, it was crazy. And he tells all of these stories that are crazy.
Yeah.
And involve him fishing for a gun in the newspaper office that he was in while high on drugs with his, 3 buddies who worked at this alternative newspaper that he'd started. And yet he still not only is working, but has 3 kids, a wife, a house in New Hampshire, and an SUV. So maybe the trend started long before us, and I think maybe part of the answer is just that. I think it's kind of, you look at the people on Facebook and you think they're but for the grace of God go I, but you also think this person is irresponsible and perhaps should not be entrusted with a job in my organization.
To be fair, I mean,
the
P.J.
people
O'Rourke,
their age are just going to be like, whatever.
But P.J. O'Rourke hasn't tried to go for a Senate confirmable position and or run for office. What P.J. O'Rourke did was he mellowed from being a young, reckless pundit to an older, still funny but somewhat more mature pundit. If you pursued that track, that's fine. You're not going to get condemned for things you said at a younger age. It's more whether or not people who start off trying to make their name in the media and then try to enter politics or policymaking get into trouble because of what they were doing back during their media days. My hunch actually... go ahead.
No, go ahead, please.
My hunch is that you're going to have 2 waves here. The first wave are going to be like, for lack of a better way of putting it, this generation's Bill Clinton's, which is... I mean, if you remember, Bill Clinton back during Vietnam was actually far-sighted enough, and you could argue politically disciplined enough or nauseating enough, take your opinion, to know that what he did on Vietnam was going to affect his political viability down the road. I remember he wrote this famous letter to his draft board, to his senator, talking about political viability when he's 19. So there are those kind of people who are going to manage to successfully wade through the Facebook/Twitter/blog era because they could see, unlike you or I, could see down the road at 19 and figure that out. And then
I think those people should be herded up and put in camps.
Well, and then 10 years later, what's going to happen is that eventually there is going to be sort of a blanket amnesty because enough people will have done enough stupid things such that much as is now perfectly fine to go to college and take out large loans, it will be perfectly fine to have said stupid things on Facebook and or blogs, what have you, in your 20s and then still run for office in your 30s.
Well, we now know that our president did cocaine, right? And that we're pretty sure that the president before him did cocaine and was an alcoholic, and that the president before him smoked pot, and I'm going to guess he did in fact inhale at some point.
Yeah.
I've always loved Barney Frank's line to that.
Which was what? Speaking
as one of the few people in Congress who will admit that he not only tried pot but inhaled, Mr. President, I think that may have been your problem. Because Clinton had said, I didn't inhale and I didn't enjoy it, so I never did it again.
That's fair.
But I think that there's going to be... I mean, I take back my remark about camps. I don't think anyone should be put in camps, not even yuppie larvae. But I think it is sort of tragic to be someone who's so focused on running for office at the age of 19 that you're doing things to preserve your political viability. I mean, preserve your dignity, fine. But just to make yourself able to, go try to get hordes of people to vote for you when you're 45, it's sort of really depressing. And I think that you're right. I think that eventually it will just be too many people. And we can't shut, many of the most interesting and indeed thoughtful and, responsible, sober people did ill-advised things of one sort or another when they were young. Mm-hmm. But I will also say that I think that the idea of going from the media into politics is just generally a bad idea. Okay. The sort of people who are good media figures are probably bad politicians.
This, by the way, is why I don't think Sarah Palin is going to run, but that's a whole separate issue. Because I think she's actually...
I think...
Yeah.
Can I just interrupt to
Sure.
say that I think that liberals are making Sarah Palin powerful, and I wish they would stop. I just wish they would stop talking about her all the time. Because the only, I really do feel that 99% of her appeal lies in the fact that liberals really hate her, and they talk about her all the time. And so people who really hate liberals think, well, if they hate her, if
Then
they're
that's who I
worried
want
about
about,
her,
yeah.
she must be really powerful and awesome, and she's not.
Yeah.
And if they would just stop talking, the problem is she's so good for rallying the liberal base that, everyone loves sitting around talking about what lunatics all the people who disagree with them are. So, finding Sarah Palin, I know I'm going to get flamed by all my commenters for saying this, but it's not a secret that I really dislike Sarah Palin. So.
Yeah. But I think she's really good at the media, and as a result, in some ways, she's Exhibit A on this. But that's a whole separate. I don't disagree with the getting off the Palin obsession, because last I checked, she actually doesn't hold any political office, so I really don't care.
Yeah, and I think the thing is that, I don't even know how she could be viable. She resigned from her governorship of Alaska after what, 3 days?
Yeah. Well,
okay, I exaggerate, but
right.
Someone who can't be bothered to stay in the elective office that they took shouldn't have a good excuse. It wasn't like my husband has cancer and we really need the family time to nurse him. It was just kind of I don't feel like being governor anymore.
What's interesting is that she actually could have used that as an excuse, not the husband, but she has a child with Down syndrome, with severe Down syndrome. That actually would have been, in my opinion, in some ways, a perfectly valid excuse, but she didn't use that.
Yeah, she just sort of left, and I don't understand how that anyone could even consider. I can't imagine that wouldn't become a fairly serious issue if she actually ran for office.
Oh, it will be a fairly serious issue, which is why I don't think she'll run for office. She'll tease and she'll be coy about it, and she will. She'll pull a Cuomo in a lot of ways, but she won't actually run. At least I don't think she will.
So who do you think is going to run? I'm still the Republican side is. I don't see a lot of fresh voices. When Obama gave his convention speech in 2004, one of my colleagues walked in and he was like, "That guy's going to be president of the United States."
Huh.
And I don't see anyone like that on the Republican side.
I haven't paid too much attention to this. Mostly I paid attention to the ways in which I think Palin won't run. But, who Paulente's going to run. I assume Mitch Daniels is going to run. Romney's obviously going to run. Huckabee's going to run. I'm trying to think who else beyond that. I assume Ron Paul will run again. Maybe Jindal will run this time. But I'm not, if he's smart, he'll wait. My favorite is John Bolton. Hasn't John Bolton said he's not ruling out a presidential bid?
Well, because you know what America needs?
More mustaches?
Ambassador.
Oh, okay.
That's what people have been. That's what America wants, really.
I think what America wants are more bushy mustaches in the Oval Office.
Well, I think that's definitely true. Is Tom Selleck is a Republican, isn't he?
Yes, I believe he is.
I bet he could run. We should start recruiting him for a governorship.
He's certainly telegenic. He might want to go for governor of California.
And he's got a great bushy mustache. Yes, he should be governor of somewhere. It doesn't have to be California. It could be Hawaii. I'm sure they love him there.
That would be true.
I'm kidding. For all the people who are going to immediately start writing me and telling me how much everyone in Hawaii hates Tom Selleck, I don't know. But it was a joke.
We should probably close. And we wanted to talk very briefly about the sort of next stage in cyber warfare, which is this worm or virus that was apparently. The report suggests that it was a virus that was designed to exploit, Microsoft and Siemens software, and by all, it took a year for it to be detected. And, if you can sort of infer from what it does, it seems to have been designed by either the U.S. or Israel specifically to cripple Iranian nuclear plants. Mm-hmm. And apparently has somewhat worked in that respect. But they're now, there was a story in the FT, and there's, multiple stories suggesting that, this virus has finally been detected.
What's interesting is that none of the news stories I saw actually named the U.S. or Israel, even though it was really obvious, who the state. You didn't really think Canada had engineered this, Sweden's cyber attack on the Iranian nuclear. And I guess maybe I don't want to put anything past Sweden.
Yeah. Don't mess with the Swedes or the Iraqis. They might have incentive to do that, or the Saudis.
But like the very clear implication was it was the U.S. or Israel, but none of the news reports mentioned it. I'm fascinated by this.
Mm-hmm.
I have to say, I suppose it's imperialist, but given my sort of aversion to the proliferation of nuclear weapons, I'm pro.
Yeah.
I'm pro the virus. I think it was a nice, neat, non-death-inducing way. I hope that no one was killed.
Well, that's one of the as far as we know, no one was killed. Although one of the ways in which it was reported was this was the first time there was a cyber attack that was designed to create a physical outcome, in the sense that it didn't just paralyze software, but it clearly led to, in essence, it was industrial sabotage.
Right, and they think that it has taken down either the enrichment facility at Natanz.
I think it was Boucher.
There was one guy who was arguing it was Natanz and not Boucher.
It would obviously make more sense to try to get Natanz because Boucher is less of a proliferation threat. But frankly, it probably was targeted at both. I have mixed feelings about this. I agree with you on the whole. This is exactly the kind of thing I presumably want my government to do because I don't want Iran to have a nuclear program, and this is the kind of thing that means you don't have to go to war. So I definitely approve of that. I think the one thing that bothers me, or the one thing I'm wondering about, is sort of the distribution of, for lack of a better way of putting it, cyber capability. In other words, it's clear that the U.S. is, way out. As much as there was a lot of concern, particularly last year, about whether or not the U.S. is vulnerable to cyber attack, U.S. offensive capabilities on this area are far and away superior to almost every other country. The concern I have is how long does it take for other countries to catch up? So, in other words, I think one of the but I think one of the things that makes me squeamish, I'll use that word, is it's great that the U.S. has gotten away with this. One of the things I'm wondering is at what point will the U.S. be the target of this kind of attack rather than the sender of this kind of attack?
Oh, I think there's no question that the U.S. is going to be the target of this sort of attack.
Yeah.
And there's no, it really is, it's like something out of a science fiction novel come true, right? It is suddenly we're not worried about the physical attack, we're worried about how do you... I would say a couple of things. From what very little I've been able to glean about what they think went on at Natanz / Boucher, probably both. The Iranians do not seem to have been running even as good security as I ran for the non-trading components of the bank networks I used to support in the 90s, back when the tools for running security were a lot more primitive than they are now. So, like, standard for if I had a nuclear facility like this, just me, no one would be allowed.
Do you have a nuclear facility like this?
I don't.
Okay, just wanted to get that out of the way.
We are looking to if we ever manage to buy a house, we're going to put one in the garage. But we don't have room for one right now.
Okay.
Because as I mentioned, mother's spare bedroom, exactly as lame as it sounds. No, I love my mother. But back to the nuclear facility, I wouldn't allow anyone. There would be no network to the outside. It would be a closed network.
Right.
There wouldn't be USB drives coming in. There wouldn't be it would be very carefully controlled. You would burn it on, if you wanted data, you would burn it on CD or you wouldn't bring it.
Right, but that's even if it works like that, one could imagine ways in which this would still be inserted into the software program.
Possibly, but if your facility is actually off the network and you're not allowing potentially infected media in, it seems kind of clear that if this stuff was actually spreading off USB drives, you're letting people bring random thumb drives, or what are they taking out on the same thumb drives? Just crazy stuff.
Well, to be fair, it might not have even been. This could be. One would assume that one other way in which the software could have gotten through would have been an actual, agent trying to put it in. But I don't want to. The problem is we don't know how the hell it happened.
We don't know. You're very right, but it's spreading. So maybe, if it spread, then it came off of somewhere.
That's a good point.
Which means that you're tapped into somehow this facility is tapped into a network in a way that seems really surprising to me. But yeah, I'm sure that we will be hit by this sort of attack, and you can't prevent all potential ingresses. My understanding is that the DoD defenses come pretty close. They've got their own hardened internet that's only for... So I think it's going to be a lot harder to break in than it is for a country that doesn't have the resources to have its own special hardened intranet that functions completely separately from the rest of the network.
Megan, I apologize. We're going to have to end this now. I have to pick up my kids, I'm afraid, from school.
Okay, well, it was been good talking to you, and
As always.
Hopefully we'll talk again soon.
Have a good weekend.
Cheers.
Bye.